What if I told you that the fate of Ukraine, and perhaps the entire war with Russia, could hinge on one shocking decision by President Zelensky? As tensions escalate and the conflict reaches a boiling point, Zelensky has made an unprecedented move that could change everything. But here's the twist. This decision could also mean the end of the war. Stick with us as we unravel the stunning possibility of Zelensky's resignation and what it means for the future of Ukraine, Europe, and the world. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky says he is willing to step down tonight. The world is shaken by shocking statements from Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Zelensky, who has been fighting with the support of the West in the shadow of the long-running war with Russia, has hinted that he is ready to resign. But is this resignation an ordinary political decision or a move that will completely change the course of the war? And could Zelensky's resignation end the war in Ukraine? What conditions did Zelensky put forward to leave office? For answers to our questions and more, here is our video. But first of all, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. Let's get started. Ukraine's president has signaled that he will leave the leadership in favor of his country's independence. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky made a resounding statement speaking at a press conference in Kiev. Zelensky said that he was ready to resign as head of state if Ukraine's joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would bring peace, emphasizing that his priority is the security of his country. Zelensky stated that he sees NATO membership as the best option. Moreover, he made it clear that he has no plans to stay at the helm of Kiev for a long time. This statement was made just as the war entered its third year. Zelensky had previously announced the postponement of the elections, saying that the country was at war. Now, he is talking about the possibility of resignation, but on one condition: Ukraine becomes a NATO member. How do you think this statement will resonate in Moscow? It is not hard to guess for Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin. Ukraine's NATO membership is the biggest red line. In fact, according to Moscow, this is precisely the reason for the war. Putin has repeatedly said that the war will escalate if Ukraine joins NATO. But could Ukraine really join NATO? Is NATO membership for Ukraine a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement? U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Heath said that Ukraine's NATO membership is not a solution to end the war, but it's not just about security. Zelensky also emphasized the importance of economic agreements with the United States, how Ukraine's natural resources will be shared. Gas, oil, minerals, there's a lot to talk about. But according to Zelensky, no deal should be made without guaranteeing the security of his country. Now, the most critical questions are on the agenda. If an agreement is reached between the United States and Ukraine, will Zelensky really resign? And more importantly, would Ukraine become a NATO member? Zelensky's exit could be a big enough move to change the course of the war. But is there any other possibility for the war to end? Can American pressure bring the war to an acceptable end? Ukraine wields considerable influence in negotiations with Russia, as long as the United States stands by Kiev and adopts a negotiating strategy that creates real dilemmas for Moscow. In recent weeks, U.S. support for Ukraine has been called into question following comments by Trump administration officials offering unilateral concessions to Moscow and criticizing Ukraine. Bilateral talks between Russia and the United States in Riyadh have raised concerns in Ukraine and Europe, but these moves are a choice, not a necessity. A good deal is still within reach if Washington is willing to pursue it. The Trump administration should go into these negotiations with a clear understanding of U.S. interests, an accurate diagnosis of the problem to be solved, a preferred sequence of possible outcomes, and a strategy on how to achieve its goal. If it does so, it can ensure a free and independent Ukraine capable of defending itself and deterring future aggression. If the United States does not help Ukraine use the advantage it has on the eve of the talks, it will give Moscow a lifeline that it will use not only in its quest to dominate Ukraine, but also to undermine U.S. interests globally. In my last year as Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council, the Biden administration prepared Ukraine for talks in 2025, regardless of who won the United States elections in 2024. Following the failed counteroffensive in 2023, The administration helped Ukraine establish 3 vectors of action that would undermine Moscow's ability to continue the war indefinitely and thus put pressure on it to negotiate seriously. One vector was to support a strategy of asymmetric attrition. According to the Ministry of Defense, Russian casualties are over 700,000 since the war began, and average 1,500 per day. Moscow's attempts to open a new line of troops from North Korea seem to have failed. This is because the number of casualties in North Korea was so high that Pyongyang did not send more. Accordingly, if he wants to fight a long war, Russian President Vladimir Putin faces the prospect of having to order a mobilization later this year, which he has tried to avoid in order to protect ordinary Russians from the reality and pain of the war front. The second vector was support for Ukraine's long-term offensive campaign. Initially by supporting the domestic drone program, and then by providing long-range attack missiles. The third was an increase in sanctions on Russia, including 50 banks and the energy sector to complicate Moscow's ability to finance a protracted war. As a result, by the end of 2024, inflation in Russia exceeded 99.5% and interest rates rose to over 21%. The United States also sent enough artillery shells, rockets, air defenses, and combat vehicles to put Ukraine in a fighting position. By 2025, a $50 billion allied loan that leveraged frozen Russian sovereign assets provided Ukraine with a financial lifeline. As a result, Russia is stuck. Moscow is still trying to dominate Ukraine, but it is gaining only thin slivers of territory in eastern Ukraine with little prospect of making very large gains. It failed to cause Ukraine's collapse by launching energy offensives over the winter. More than 6 months after the invasion of Ukraine, it still has not retaken all the Russian territory that Ukraine seized in K. Some observers and politicians, including in the Trump administration, believe that the outcome of the Ukrainian war matters little to the United States, and that European security is a distraction from the primary U.S. strategic challenge of countering China. Yet, even if U.S. national interests are viewed through the prism of America first, and there is little value in maintaining a rules-based order or strengthening NATO, the United States has at least 4 core interests in preventing Russia from winning in Ukraine and ensuring a free and sovereign Ukraine. First, since the war began, Russia has significantly deepened its cooperation with China, North Korea, and Iran. It has received critical assistance from each of them, including machine tools, microelectronics, and co-production partnerships from China to help it rebuild its military, missiles and drones from Iran, artillery, and soldiers from North Korea. In return, the Kremlin has provided each of them with unprecedented military and technological assistance far beyond what it had previously imagined. This cooperation is permanent and poses a real threat to U.S. interests if Russia prevails in Ukraine. It will be a victory for all 3 of these partners. Without them, Moscow would have already lost. As Russia's allies show reciprocity, this unity between U.S. adversaries and enemies will grow more pronounced. A peace treaty between Russia and China is unlikely to cause a split. Their leaders have too close ties, particularly China. China would be empowered by a Russian triumph, and may make judgments regarding the United States' readiness to remain faithful to a partner via any means. Second, the United States would benefit by a free and independent Ukraine surviving. Third, the biggest in Europe, behind Russia and Turkey, the Ukrainian army will come out of the war, particularly in drone warfare and the usage of artificial intelligence in military. It has pioneered innovative ideas. It will assist Europe in restoring her defense industrial base and share this technology with the United States about the direction of warfare. The United States has much to learn from Ukraine. Ukraine is probably a powerful and dependable friend of the United States in other spheres, particularly the Indo-Pacific, where it can counsel and support U.S. partners. Third, a Russian triumph in Ukraine would greatly raise the threat to numerous European nations that are strongly pro-American and allocate a sizable portion of their GDP for defense. These comprise Poland, which is approaching 4.7%, Lithuania, which has promised to spend more than 5% of its GDP on defense over the next 2 years, Latvia at 3.45%, and Estonia at 3.2%. Western European nations will not have enough capabilities to prevent a Russian invasion for many years to come, even if they instantly raise their defense budgets. They also probably lack will. Others in Western Europe do not do more. Hence, the United States should not relinquish its alliance pledge to sovereign nation-states that do whatever Washington orders. At last, and maybe most significantly, the United States' interests in a stable and peaceful Europe, the biggest export market and foreign investment source for the United States, is Europe, which also serves as a major ally, usually in line with United States policies on major world political concerns. Should the discussions fail and a Russian triumph emerges, it will cause a geopolitical black hole in Europe that will not be cleanly isolated from the rest of the globe. This might include planting the seeds of future conflicts that would extend beyond Ukraine, undermining pro-American governments in Europe, and giving Russia the chance to project power worldwide, especially in the Middle East, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific, compromising U.S. interests. Russia wants a neutral and weakened Ukraine, while Ukraine wants the security capacity and guarantees to discourage and defend itself against future invasion. These are the primary issues the negotiators have to overcome. Putin insisted in a speech to his own foreign ministry in June 2024 that Ukraine should adopt a neutral status, be denuclearized and disarmed, and requested that Ukraine turn over the whole provinces of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Since then, he has maintained this stance in a number of interviews, characterizing Ukrainian President Zelensky as an illegitimate leader without the power to sign a contract committing the conflict to be ended. Putin has also insisted on rigorous restrictions on the size and breadth of the Ukrainian army, including a ban on offensive weapons, and an efficient Russian veto on any international security guarantees given to Ukraine, and Western security guarantees for Russia. Such an outcome would have been utterly intolerable. No Ukrainian leadership can embrace radical restrictions on its capacity to defend itself. A change of government in Kyiv requires a strategy that will discourage Russia from launching any kind of war once more at any moment. Officially, the Ukrainian government wants all of its sovereign territory, including Crimea, along with NATO membership back so that Russia cannot strike once more and start a more general war. However, there are signs that Ukraine would be willing to accept a freeze of the territorial border if Russian gains are not legally recognized, and if allies support Ukraine's right to reclaim territory through non-military means. Most importantly for Ukrainians, they will be compensated with firm security guarantees for the rest of the country and a promise of political and economic integration into the West. Accordingly, the task for the United States and its allies should be clear work with Kyiv on an outcome that ensures a free and independent Ukraine capable of defending itself and preventing a future attack, and then persuade Putin to accept it. As we approach these possible end states, the United States' strategy should be to create a dilemma for Russia about the type of Ukraine it can face. The Trump administration has a very different view, but Washington can categorically rule out neutralization of Ukraine or formal neutrality, and should instead put three options on the table: the Norwegian model of NATO membership, the Israeli model, and the European security guarantee. Each of these options has significant disadvantages for Russia. There is a plausible argument that the Norwegian model of NATO membership could be more attractive to Moscow than the Israeli model or European troops, especially if it opens up the possibility of a wider debate about Ukrainian offensive weapons and some limitations on the European architecture. These are things that would normally be rejected by Ukraine and the Allies, but could be discussed and considered by the alliance if Russia accepts Ukraine's membership of NATO. Moreover, under the Norwegian model, there would be no NATO troops in Ukraine, and its government would be somewhat constrained by its allies. The Israeli model, on the other hand, would mean a heavily armed and insecure Ukraine that would have to fend for itself, and would therefore be prone to preemptive self-defense and unilateral kinetic action in the form of sabotage, covert action, and assassination. Adding enhanced indirect support means that if Russia invades again, the United States will provide military and intelligence support to Ukraine just as it has done for the last 3 years, but with no restrictions on the use of allied weapons inside Russia. The presence of European troops means that, in addition to Ukraine's rearmament, Russia will have to contend with NATO member state forces closer to its border, capable of tracking troop movements and training Ukrainian forces in the country. The Kremlin can take solace in Europe's lack of readiness to fulfill this task. but it would certainly be concerned about a future United States administration providing a security guarantee for these troops. The aim of any negotiation should be to force Russia to confront the dilemmas it faces and test the limits of its tolerance. Russia is likely to reject the Norwegian model, but the United States could then turn to the Israeli model, which is better than a European military deployment that the Europeans themselves are not prepared to effectively implement. In short, while Plan A would be the Norwegian model, the Israeli model would be the fallback as Plan B. Russia could, of course, reject the Israeli model NATO and the European guarantee and stick to its maximalist goals. Therefore, the United States must continue to support Ukraine and keep the pressure on Russia, especially through asymmetric attrition, which will make it harder for Russia to wage a long war. The Trump administration will be reluctant to ask Congress for new military aid for Ukraine, but doing so would send an important message to Moscow. Meanwhile, proposals for European governments to buy United States weapons for Ukraine will face objections at the Pentagon because of how low United States inventories are and the demands from other regions. One way to overcome these two problems would be to send the message that the defense industry should increase production through legislation, financing the production of general ammunition. If the Trump administration supports Ukraine in negotiations and uses the leverage it has, it could secure the Israeli model for Ukraine. This deal would not be perfect because it deprives Ukraine of external security guarantees, while under a democratic administration, there is a path to NATO along the Norwegian model. Such an outcome is clearly not acceptable to Trump. The Israeli model provides a viable path to a free and independent Ukraine capable of self-defense and deterring future attacks, and over time it can serve as a stepping stone to a more lasting and just peace. Thank you for tuning in.